Good afternoon. I'm Beth Badalino, President and CEO of HealthyWomen, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar, Women in Clinical Trials, the Challenge of Research During the Reproductive Years. This is an issue HealthyWomen is championing, and we could not be more proud to host today's gathering. I want to thank our HealthyWomen's Corporate Advisory Council for their support of this webinar, allowing us to shine an even brighter spotlight on this issue. It is striking to consider that it wasn't that long ago that there were no federal regulations in place requiring the inclusion of women in clinical trials. Trials that were studying the very conditions and diseases that often disproportionately, differently, or uniquely affect women. We've come a long way in a relatively short time, but there are still significant challenges that exist to ensure that all women are best represented. Today, you will hear from a number of experts who will examine new barriers women are facing, especially as it relates to the inclusion of women of reproductive age, pregnant women, and women who are lactating and breastfeeding. We often forget pregnant women get sick and sick women get pregnant. Many women, while pregnant or breastfeeding, are taking medications for other conditions. We have to have clinical trial representation of this population to ensure therapies and medications are safe and effective for both mom and baby. Before I turn it over to our moderator and our outstanding speakers, I would like to thank Congresswoman Lois Frankel, who has been a congressional leader in this area and has graciously provided us video remarks to kick off our program this afternoon. Congresswoman Frankel has served in the United States House of Representatives since 2013 and currently represents Florida's 22nd Congressional District. The Congresswoman serves on a powerful appropriations committee, including Labor, Health and Human Services, Education, and related agency subcommittees, which has the responsibility for funding the National Institutes of Health.
Hello, everyone. I'm Lois Frankel, member of Congress from South Florida. Thank you, HealthyWomen, for putting together this event, for your good work. A shout out to the panelists for lending your expertise as we talk about including pregnant and lactating women in clinical trials. More than 3 million women give birth in the United States every year, and we expect that number will grow due to the bans on abortion across this nation. Our expectant mothers and our mothers deserve to be safe and healthy as they navigate the challenges and the good challenges of pregnancy and new motherhood. That means not only taking care of themselves, but knowing which medications and medical devices are safe for them to use and at what dosage. More than 90% of pregnant women report taking a medication at some point during their pregnancy. However, only 1% of clinical trials mention the word pregnancy or pregnant, and less than 1% mention lactation. Because of this, pregnant and lactating women are often left with little or no information to help them decide whether or not they can take different medications or undergo different therapies while they're pregnant. Some new mothers may even opt out of breastfeeding or decline to take medications because they're unsure how certain drugs may affect their child. Some of these drugs may even be the difference between life and death. So this is something to pay attention to, especially since maternal mortality is on the rise. We can and must do much better for pregnant and lactating women, and we're working in Congress to address this issue. In 2016, we established a task force on research specific to pregnant and lactating women to identify and address gaps on knowledge and what medical treatments are safe for these women. The task force released 15 recommendations on how to best include these women in clinical trials, like providing additional resources and funding for research into conditions affecting pregnant and lactating women, and developing programs to create therapeutic products to address their healthcare needs. I'm also pleased to report that a group of bipartisan colleagues and I were able to secure funding for an advisory committee to oversee the implementation of these recommendations. We made further progress in the budget we passed last year, which requires diversity action plans for clinical trials used by the FDA. I'll continue to fight in Congress to ensure pregnant and lactating women have the information they need to be safe and healthy. And let me just say that being the grandmother of two beautiful young toddlers, it gives me much more incentive. So thank you for your advocacy and for hosting this event. Have a great webinar.
Our thanks to Congresswoman Frankel for taking time to prepare those remarks. And now it's with great pleasure to pass it over to our moderator and current member of the Healthy Women Board of Directors, Marcia Henderson. Marcia is the former Associate Commissioner for Women's Health at the FDA and a fierce fighter for the health of women and their families. Marcia, take it away.
Well, thank you for that kind introduction, Beth, and good afternoon to everyone. I'm honored to moderate our briefing today because I'm passionate about this topic, research and the inclusion of women in clinical trials. For over 20 years, I worked at FDA in the Office of Women's Health. Our mission evolved over time as we moved from supporting guidance changes to advancing FDA's regulatory decision-making using sex as a biological variable. During my tenure, the office produced and funded more than 350 research papers and journal articles. Collectively, they have enhanced FDA's understanding of sex differences and conditions unique to women. And I'm proud of the panel that we have put together today, highlighting efforts to expand women's participation to advance the inclusion of pregnant and lactating women in clinical trials. We will hear from a variety of perspectives representing the research community, industry, academia, government, and of course, the patient. Before I hand it off to our first speaker, I want to mention one housekeeping item and briefly introduce each of our panelists. If you have a question during any of the panelists' presentations, please type it in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We will be collecting all of the submitted questions and answering as many of them as we can once all panelists have completed their presentations. With that, I will now introduce our amazing speakers. First, we will hear from Rebecca Abbott, Senior Director of Advocacy for the Society of Maternal Fetal Medicine. Rebecca leads the organization's policy and advocacy activities related to obstetric research, public health, and access to care. Next, we will hear from Dr. Diana Bianchi, who serves as the director of the Eunice Kennedy Shriver National Institutes of Child Health and Human Development at the National Institutes of Health. Dr. Bianchi leads the Institute's research and training to improve reproductive health and enhance the lives of children and adolescents. Next, Kay Matthews, founders of the Shades of Blue Project, will speak. The organization is dedicated to helping women of color before, during, and after childbirth. Our final speaker will be Ramita Tandon, who serves as the Chief Clinical Trials Officer at Walgreens and is responsible for leading and driving growth of the company's new clinical trials business. Rebecca, I will now pass it over to you to begin.
Thank you so much for the introduction and for the opportunity to share why the physicians I work for are so invested in efforts to include more women in clinical trials. As Ms. Henderson noted, I work for the Society for Maternal Fetal Medicine, which is a physician specialty society representing maternal fetal medicine subspecialists, or MFMs, who are obstetricians, gynecologists with additional training in caring for individuals experiencing high-risk pregnancies. Next slide. There are a number of ways that patients come into an MFM practice. As noted earlier in the presentation, women who are sick become pregnant. Recent data indicates that about 1 in 5 women of reproductive age in the United States have 2 or more chronic conditions. And while the existence of one of these conditions does not guarantee poor pregnancy outcomes, it does put patients at greater risk. While compiling a comprehensive list of those conditions is difficult, I've included some examples on this slide. You'll see conditions from asthma to hypertension and HIV to hepatitis. Next slide. Another way that patients come to an MFM practice is that they develop a condition during pregnancy that threatens the health of themselves or their baby. Examples of these conditions include preeclampsia, which is dangerously high blood pressure brought on by pregnancy, or gestational diabetes. Next slide. So when we consider the patients our members care for, SMFM is focused broadly on promoting research on the health of women throughout their reproductive years to ensure that they can come into pregnancy healthy, that we understand how to effectively manage their chronic conditions, and we understand how best to manage a woman's care after the baby is born and before they become pregnant again. The ultimate research goal for our members is to improve the health of women so MFMs see fewer high-risk pregnancies. And we are so grateful for the work of HealthyWomen and other partners for joining us in advancing that goal. Next slide. That being said, we recognize that women will continue to enter pregnancy with pre-existing conditions, or they will develop dangerous conditions during pregnancy. And a common thread through all of these high-risk pregnancies is that the women will need to take medications. Next slide. The latest data indicate that about 9 in 10 women report taking some type of medication during pregnancy. This could be anything from Tylenol to Claritin to Tums. Next slide. But we also know that about 7 in 10 women report taking at least one prescription medication. Next slide. So we know that pregnant patients are taking medications. However, we know very little about the safety and efficacy of those medications during pregnancy. And this is due to our clinical trials infrastructure systematically excluding pregnant and lactating people from trials. And if you're new to this issue, exclusion of these populations might actually seem like the right decision, as it would protect a pregnant woman and her fetus from the potential harmful effects of new and novel medications. But obstetricians and MFMs see it from a different perspective. Every day, multiple times a day, they see a real harm that comes from exclusion of these populations from research. As noted before, our members are treating pregnant patients that need to take medications to keep themselves and their pregnancies healthy. And MFMs are counseling those patients with very limited safety data. They also have limited data on the efficacy of medications during pregnancy. In other words, do the physiological changes in a pregnant person's body, for example, the increased blood volume that comes during pregnancy, change the dosing needs or how the medication will be metabolized by the body? And do those changes impact whether or not the medication is still doing its job? Next slide. Obstetricians are super used to practicing in this ambiguity. A recent study from our peers in the European Union found about 74% of pregnant women receive medications off-label, which means the medications weren't approved for use in pregnancy, and there's likely limited data on safety and efficacy. And our members help patients navigate the risks and benefits associated with taking those medications. And while our members have become adept at practicing this way, it doesn't mean that it's the best way to practice medicine, and it doesn't mean that there aren't consequences. As an example, one of the classes of medications most commonly discontinued during pregnancy and while breastfeeding are antidepressants. Next slide. Because we have failed to conduct well-controlled studies on antidepressant use during pregnancy and lactation, there's mixed data on their safety. And as a result, physicians and patients are reluctant to treat depression with medications during this time. But we also know that untreated depression has negative impacts on both maternal and infant health. In fact, the most recent data from the CDC shows that mental health conditions are the leading cause of maternal deaths in the pregnancy and postpartum period. As this example clearly illustrates, our failure to gather the necessary safety and efficacy data creates situations where patients and clinicians make decisions based on unknown or perceived harm rather than clear and robust safety data. Next slide. Before I close, I want to highlight some of the work advocates are doing to address this issue. In a moment, Dr. Bianchi will share details on the PRGLAC task force, which Congresswoman Frankel referenced in her remarks, and we are grateful for NICHD's leadership on this issue. SMFM and other stakeholders have been working alongside our agency partners to create a new research culture that protects women through research rather than from it. SMFM is a proud founding member of the Coalition to Advance Maternal Therapeutics, which was formed in 2014 to address this issue and of which HealthyWomen is a member. The coalition advocated for the creation of the PRGLAC task force and continues to advocate for implementation of its recommendations. Next slide. In February, members of the House of Representatives introduced bipartisan legislation to implement some of that task force recommendations. Led by Representatives Kathy Castor, Brian Fitzpatrick, and Lauren Underwood, the Advancing Safe Medications for Moms and Babies Act would implement foundational steps to ensure that pregnant and lactating people are included in research. So I've included some of the provisions of the bill on this slide and encourage you to reach out to me or folks at HealthyWomen if you'd like additional information. So thank you so much for the opportunity to speak, and I'll turn it back to Ms. Anderson.
Well, thank you, Rebecca, for that wonderful background. And now we'll move to Dr. Bianchi because this is exactly what she does. So help provide some clarity about the research you're doing at the NIH.
Thank you very much, Marcia. Could I have the next slide, please? So the lack of inclusion in research complicates medical decision for pregnant and lactating people, as you've already heard so far. Around 4 million people give birth in the US each year, and 90% of them are taking at least one medication, as you heard Becky say. But it's just a tragedy in our country that the evidence for safety, efficacy, and dosing of therapies in pregnant and lactating persons is severely lacking. So as you heard, in 2016, as part of the 21st Century Cures Act, there was established a task force on research specific to pregnant and lactating women. The term women was used at the time, and the leadership of the task force was given to NICHD representing NIH, although multiple federal agencies participated. Next slide, please. So as you can see here, there's a photo of the members of the original PRGLAC task force, and we had a very wide distribution of representation, including multiple institutes of NIH. There are 27 of them. The CDC, FDA, AHRQ, HRSA, HHS, the VA, multiple professional societies, industry, academia, and nonprofits all participated in a series of meetings that were highly engaging. And we presented to Congress in 2018 a report that included 15 recommendations on how to promote the inclusion of pregnant and lactating women in clinical trials. We didn't want that report to sit on a shelf somewhere gathering dust. And so we asked the secretary to give us authority to extend PRGLAC to be able to give advice on how to implement the recommendations. And we have taken this as part of our mission. Although our name is NICHD, for example, we are the leading funder of research of people of reproductive age and the leading funder of maternal health research. We are working together with all of the institutes and centers at NIH to how to implement our recommendations, as well as with our other partners. So the implementation is ongoing as part of the fiscal year 23 appropriations language. We have been asked to fund a working group of council to keep the momentum going. Next slide, please. So some of the language you've already heard are really taken from our key recommendations, and our mantra is to protect pregnant people through research instead of from research. As you probably are aware, there's been a history of thinking that pregnant women should be protected from exposure to everything. And when in fact, if this is a sick pregnant person who needs her medication, then she needs to take it. And we need to have evidence to convince her and her providers that the medication is safe for her and the baby. We need to change this existing culture that has really limited scientific knowledge regarding safety of therapeutics, the effectiveness, and how to dose the medication in pregnant and lactating people, because metabolism changes. Now, HHS has been successful in removing pregnant people as a vulnerable population through the common rule. FDA still has not removed that, and that's why that is in HR 1117. There's also a great need to expand the workforce of clinicians and researchers with expertise in obstetric and lactation pharmacology and therapeutics. And we know that if we can provide funding, that we will be able to train more people. We're also working towards removing regulatory barriers. The recommendations and the full report are publicly available at the link shown here. Next slide, please. Just to give you an example of a successful study and an example of how NICHD funding is being used to implement PRGLAC recommendations, I'd like to tell you just a little bit about the CUDDLE study, which is an acronym for commonly used drugs during lactating and infant exposure. This is an opportunistic study that is taking place in Utah, taking advantage of the fact that there are some women who are taking prescription drugs, 50 to 70% of them. And as you've heard, there's very little information for both pregnant women and lactating women on their medications. We don't know very much about transfer into breast milk. So in this study, they are taking advantage of people who are lactating, who are using medications, and are willing to give a sample of breast milk, willing to give a maternal blood sample, and then a little baby heel stick sample. And currently they have 1,600 people enrolled, and they've prioritized 10 drugs that are commonly used. And we recently heard a presentation from the principal investigator about the results for oxycodone, a pain medication, nifedipine, a blood pressure medication, and ondansetron, which is an anti-nausea medication. And the results were striking because they showed that very little of these drugs are getting into the baby's circulation, far less than if the baby had been given recommended doses of some of these medications directly. So very, very low levels. So impressive were the data that they have already been transferred to the FDA to be considered for changing drug labeling. But these are only 3 drugs out of hundreds that lactating people could be taking. Next slide. Another study that we did following PRGLAC is called the A+ study, which was an acronym for azithromycin prevention and labor use trial. And this was research supported by our global network for women and children's research, as well as the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. It was performed in 7 low and middle income countries, enrolled more than 29,000 pregnant people. And it tested whether 2 grams given orally of the inexpensive antibiotic azithromycin could reduce postpartum sepsis and death. The study was stopped early because there was a clear maternal benefit. It was able, just the administration of this drug orally reduced by 1/3 the risk of postpartum sepsis and death. It did not, however, have an effect on the newborns, but because it had such a clear maternal benefit, it was stopped and published very recently in the New England Journal of Medicine. Next slide. And then lastly, one of our major programs that we have formed following the implementation of PRGLAC is the Imprint Hub, which is advancing frontiers in health through maternal and pediatric precision in therapeutics. And this is a core with centers of excellence that is serving as a national resource for expertise in maternal and pediatric therapeutics. It is conducting and fostering therapeutics-focused research in obstetrics, lactation, and pediatrics, as well as including people with disabilities. Pregnant people with disabilities are a very underserved population. This is directly addressing the underrepresentation of women and children in clinical trials. It is both a service center where researchers can pose questions, get advice, get educated. It enhances availability of knowledge and regulatory science, as well as drug development tools. And it synergizes with other resources and networks. We fund several centers that are studying both lactation as well as genomics and how genomics affect drug metabolism. Next slide, please. So what's going to happen in the future? Well, I regret to say that in 2021, Dr. Cernich, our deputy director, and Ms. Kaiser and I wrote a commentary that received a lot of attention in JAMA, and it was really around the fact that providing vaccines to pregnant people during the COVID-19 pandemic really should have happened earlier and should have happened following the recommendations in PRGLAC. So we took the PRGLAC recommendations and showed how they could have been used to help pregnant people who were essentially left behind when vaccines first became available. Next slide, please. So we need, go back, thank you. We need to plan to include pregnant and lactating people for evaluating treatments and vaccines in future pandemics before another pandemic occurs. Remember that pregnant people were told to talk to their obstetric care providers, and their obstetric care providers had no data for them. So in this viewpoint, we tried to provide a roadmap to say, this is what we need to do in the future. We also have several recommendations as part of PRGLAC that still need to occur. We need to create a public awareness campaign to engage public people and healthcare providers in research on pregnant and lactating people. We also need to develop and implement evidence-based communication strategies with healthcare providers on information relevant to research on pregnant and lactating people. This is a little bit outside of the purview of NIH, but we need to partner with organizations that can do these public awareness campaigns. And then we also need to develop separate programs to study therapeutic products used off patent in pregnant and lactating people using the NIH BPCA as a model. And this is one of the things that I hope we will be dealing with in our council working group, which will be co-led by Christina Bucci-Retwig, who is actually a physician, but she is also working in industry, and she was a great source of information about industry concerns and a member of the PRGLAC task force. Next slide, please. So with that, I will hand the virtual podium back to Marcia. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I left FDA in beginning of 2019, having worked on PRGLAC, and I'm just thrilled to see the results and also the opportunity to consider lessons learned during the COVID-19 process. So it's wonderful to hear this update. Now, all of this is being made possible by the opportunity to work with patients. None of this research could happen without it. So I'm delighted to introduce Kay Matthews as our next speaker. Kay.
Thank you, Ms. Henderson. Next slide. So what you've already heard from my colleagues in their presentations is, to be honest, we have the power to change the past. There are so many different solutions that are out there, but as someone who is coming to you today from the community perspective, there are some gaps that must be filled. Next slide. We cannot ignore the very things that is keeping community members from engaging with clinical trials. And so these are a few of the things that the community is saying. One of them we know for sure with folks of color is historical trauma is there. It is oftentimes the motivator for why we don't participate in it. And so we have to get really engaged in how we address that historical trauma from then and then where we are now. I call it historical trauma because it sets the foundation for how we move forward, and it's still very prevalent today. And then the lack of engagement. And I say that based on one's prior experiences. It's, I don't want to engage with you maybe because of the treatment that I experienced from you, or maybe a colleague or anything, whatever that means for you. A prior experience typically lends to one's lack of engagement, a lack of understanding. You heard Dr. Bianchi talk about campaigns that are driven by the community. That is going to be one way, because we don't all learn the same. And so we have to think from that perspective. If you are talking to different audiences, you're going to have to create a language, resources, information that is put out there that is going to be a coverall for one's understanding. And then access. How do we honestly provide true access to a lot of what we've already seen? Again, the solutions, but who has access to those solutions is what we really have to start working towards. Next slide. And so as a voice of the community and the clients and the consumer, however you see the folks that are out there, I always have to show and share a community perspective or story on what's happening out there, how fear can stop the progress. Again, we have the power, but we are going to have to address these different elements that are happening out there, even for us. And so we're not exempt from the fear that sometimes these clinical trials or what is needed to make progress go forward, fear can stop that from happening. So this is a story from one of my moms. Prior to COVID, I was pregnant and told so much different information about vaccination that I was literally afraid that I was going to get COVID-19 and die. And although I had a fear of dying, I was too afraid to participate in the clinical trials for the vaccination being offered during that time. I truly felt like it was a lose-lose battle, and so I decided to do either. Just hearing that, reading that, and seeing that should be startling to us all, because this is how a lot of folks feel, especially pregnant and lactating women. We're told so many things: go off your medicine, don't go off your medicine, wean yourself off your medicine. It's all these different things that we hear in the community. And so what is happening is we're forming our own view of what's happening, whether wrong or right. We're just, again, using context and putting it together and making those decisions. And so when COVID-19, the pandemic happened, a lot of people of color were not getting the vaccination. Again, that goes back to that historical trauma. And no, we're not in the early 40s or things like that. But in 2023, there are a lot of things that are still happening in clinical trials that are not benefiting people of color. And so until we, again, address the historical trauma first in order to move forward, being more inclusive, as my colleague Rebecca mentioned about mental health being one of the conditions that lends to adverse outcomes in that first year postpartum. That's telling you right now of what's going on. And so it's not that we don't know the problem. It's really honestly about working together to work on what those issues are. what the issue is and what is the solution. So being more focused on the solution is where we sit now, if we are going to honestly make the past different. Next slide. And so again, thinking from the perspective of solutions for change, because that's where we sit right now. This is the power that we can activate in a collective way, because no one of us can do this and make this all different. We are going to have to band together and see value in every position that one's plays. So me being a part of this webinar, it's a push towards change. Having a community voice, participate in things like this and bringing that community perspective is important, because no matter how you see us, the community, the client or consumer, we are the biggest part of this. And so you have to start to address how we feel and what is hindering us in the progress to change the past. And so assuring that clinical trials are accessible to communities of color, access. That's number one. To know that something out there exists, but to not know how you can have access to it, that is a big problem that we are going to have to work through as well. Communication that is person-centered and yield basic understanding and capabilities. And so we really truly have to think about everyone does not learn at the same level, and you're going to have campaigns that is, again, a coverall for everybody's understanding, so that we can get and yield better results than what we're getting now. Listening to the stories of the lived experience and examining how that becomes a factor in outcomes. If you do not value the fact that there is historical trauma associated with a lot of what is happening, then you're missing the mark, and you will never get the results or the better outcomes that you want if you do not listen to the stories of folks with lived experience. Assuring that engagement with patients is done with compassion, intentionality, and clear understanding, meaning I hear you, I see you, I value and I respect you, and this is how we move forward. That's simple to do. That is really, truly, honestly, what we call putting compassionate care back into a lot of what is happening in the healthcare spectrum and then all the way across the board. Next slide. And so in closing, what we know is we must first build trust within our communities of color before we will truly be able to have a lasting impact for change. It's the only way. Thank you. I'll turn it back over to Ms. Henderson.
Thank you for your comments. And our next speaker can really talk about community engagement, because she is Ramita Tandon from Walgreens. So you're next, Ramita.
Thanks, Marcia. And Kay, what a fantastic set of remarks that you made around access and just listening to the voice of the communities, particularly in underrepresented patient populations. The history of women in trials has been checkered, and I won't go through the entire history, and certainly you can go to the next slide. But as we trace back to the tragedies that, Kay touched on as well, that including resulting from the use of thalidomide in pregnant women from more than 60 years ago, concerns led to the adoption of research guidelines that designated pregnant women a vulnerable population. Fast forwarding to June 10th, 1993, nearly 30 years ago to this day, the FDA issued a guideline that formally rescinded a 1977 policy that banned most women of childbearing age from participating in clinical research studies. Now, and to ensure that the policies for inclusion were firmly implemented by NIH, Congress finally made what had previously been just a policy into law, the NIH Revitalization Act of 1993, section titled Women and Minorities as Subjects in Clinical Research. So over the last 30 years, we've definitely seen some progress in clinical research to improve the participation of women. In fact, in 2016, the FDA launched the Diverse Women in Clinical Trials Initiative to raise awareness about clinical trial participation by women. And according to the latest available data from the FDA, today more than half of clinical trial participants are women. But despite these improvements, the FDA has also made it clear that more women from diverse backgrounds still need to participate in research across all ages, races, ethnicities, and sexual orientation, as well as women with disabilities and chronic health conditions. So headlines around this lack of women in research are still very pervasive, as you can see from the small sample. Now, next slide. Addressing these industry-wide access and diversity issues across gender, as well as ageism and logistical barriers, lack of diversity in clinical trials that you've heard from my colleagues early on, as well as just systemic societal factors, needs us to think differently as we think about changing the paradigm of care for women. Now, I believe one of the promising avenues for improving these trends, and which is why I'm here, and which is why Walgreens is very active in as we move into healthcare, and particularly in clinical trials, is using community pharmacies as a conduit to help support many of the efforts and breaking some of this, some of these issues that we've been seeing at a community level. You know, we've seen that providing greater convenience and access to potential participants will certainly yield more access to generalizable to the entire population, as certain medications impact men and women differently. We've certainly we've heard the rise of decentralized clinical trials and the recent push by the FDA to increase access to make trials more closer to where the patients are could actually address some of these logistical and lifestyle challenges of women to lead to a faster trial startup times through proactive identification, recruitment, and enrollment in all communities. Now, today at Walgreens, our mission is to fundamentally change the paradigm for patient experience and better connectivity of care for drug development research. Last year at Walgreens, we launched our clinical trials program, whereby we're focused on building the future of clinical trials by creating more of a proactive, equitable, and patient-centric research enterprise to provide all patients across the US an opportunity to participate. Now, I think we all recognize the clinical trial model today is very antiquated and in crisis. Nearly 80% of trials fail to meet their enrollment goals, and less than 5% of the US population participates in clinical research, and nearly 3/4 of those that participate are white. So at Walgreens, as you know, Kate touched on, one of the things that's very important to us is that we're listening to the voices of those that have historically been underrepresented in research, and demonstrating how clinical trials may be a viable care option for patients who typically standard of care option may not be accessible, or certainly not an option to help improve their health outcomes. And so for us, rather than just continuing to talk about the issues, we've taken steps to activate the entire Walgreens horsepower with the 120-year brand and trust that we have within our communities, the 9,000 stores and pharmacies that are across the US, whereby 78% of the US population is within 5 miles of a Walgreens. Our goal is to be able to create a pioneer solution that makes clinical trials more accessible, convenient, and equitable. Next slide. Through the launch of our clinical trials program, we are offering our locations as an opportunity, as a welcome entry point for patients to come in, to be educated, to be engaged, and ultimately to be empowered to make the decision to want to participate in clinical trials. As we know, as we've heard, there are a tremendous number of barriers that exist, whether they're travel barriers, whether there's language barriers, historical trauma that Kay mentioned, or even certainly health and literacy issues. It's not a one-size-fits-all strategy, and we recognize that at Walgreens, which is why we're leveraging our physical footprint as an opportunity for patients to be able to come in, learn about clinical trials, understand the benefits, the risks, and give them the empowerment to make the decision to participate. From our perspective, next slide, as we bring clinical trials closer to the patients and build that right highway, our goal is to be able to provide a set of services that enable patients access and better convenience. So whether it's coming into our stores to be able to conduct a clinical trial visit, whether it's screening, diagnostic, and phlebotomy services, whether it's doing in more of a hybrid fashion, whether, to digitize and use remote digital technologies to allow for patients to do it at the convenience of their homes. We want to make clinical trials accessible and convenient. Like I mentioned earlier, it's not a one-size-fits-all, and we'll continue to face the challenges with health literacy, transportation, work and life responsibilities, as well as trust and fear among women. And so for us at Walgreens, we're opening up our doors to improve access for patients who've traditionally been left out of research in terms of using active engagement. Innovation and increased access to quality of care has always been part of the Walgreens DNA, and we plan to extend this to clinical trials. We believe the more we enable, engage, and empower, the more likely women may take the time to ask their healthcare providers, whether it's a pharmacist or a doctor, if a clinical trial may be a suitable care option for their particular disease condition. Now, I recognize it'll take an ecosystem of partners to move the needle on access and equity. But together we must commit to raising the industry standards in health equity and access in clinical trials. Moving the needle requires us to rethink the system, not just reactively adjusting. The time is now to talk less and do more, because together we can. Thank you. Turn it over to Marcia.
Thank you for those great remarks, Ramita. And while I have you, I think I'll ask you the first question. And that question is, why should a pregnant person participate in a trial when there's the possibility that it might harm their fetus?
Well, from a Walgreens perspective, we do believe we want to make sure that clinical trials is accessible to every patient, including pregnant women. And we want them to give them an opportunity to learn more about the trial, understand the risks and the benefits, but serve as a conduit for patients to be able to participate and to be able to gain valuable insights as pregnant women participate in trials. Those valuable insights then become a huge opportunity to be able to contribute into the science and advance the medications for all patients, and making sure that the information that we have on that particular drug or device is equitable and also representative of the US population, including pregnant women.
Hey, I know you have experience talking to women, trying to encourage pregnant people to come into trials. What do you say to them? You know they're reluctant, you know they're scared, you know that there's a trust issue. What is it that you say to them to try to move them in this direction?
One of the first things I ask is, what exactly is the fear? And so without understanding that, I can't help to help them navigate where they need to go to next. And so honestly, it's about first dismantling maybe the misinformation that they heard. Again, we tend to gather pieces here and put them all together and come up with our own view. And so first of all, the first question is asking, what exactly is your fear? What do you know? What have you heard, in order for us to move forward and us to, show them some guidance on where to go next? I will say infographics work. We need to see the information just as plain as can be, along with pictures. It just all has to make sense. This is what I talk about with learning in different ways. Infographics don't work for everybody, but most often my best results have been yielded from an infographic that has the information, and they can kind of see the graphics, the colors. All of those things are sensory things that we don't even think about, but that's a way of learning. And that's the first thing that we do, is we address the fear and what they've already come up with, and work to get them moving in the right direction with the right information.
One of the questions that we've received directed directly to you, Kay, is, do you work with clinical trial companies? And how do you recruit? Do you actually participate in recruiting patients for trials?
I have, in a few different ways, really more through the explanation. Again, getting them the right information into their hands has been our best success. And so wanting to really honestly run into more folks who see the value of working with community partners. I've not experienced a lot of that. Most of what I have partnerships that have come about has been through introductions or prior work that we've done, but definitely looking for more ways to get folks to participate, because the gist of it is we are people of color not participating in this, we're being left out. We need to be a part of the equation. We need to be a part of the biggest factor of it to see how these things are going to affect us. But there again is so much historical trauma that is there. And if we keep skipping on over it to yield better results, we're never going to get them. So the long answer to that is yes, and certainly looking for more ways to be able to engage the community so that we can get the participation that we need.
And Dr. Bianchi, there's a question here related specifically to PRGLAC. And it's, I think you've alluded to it somewhat because it's very clear that the common rule no longer includes that for NIH, but for FDA, is there a schedule where you think that we could anticipate, even though you can't speak for another agency, do you anticipate that there is a general feeling of acceptance of removing pregnant people from that restriction?
Well, it's difficult for me to speak for another agency. As you know, FDA participated actively in PRGLAC, and in our follow-up meetings, we do ask representatives of FDA what is happening. And to the best of my knowledge, pregnant people have not yet been removed according to FDA regulations. So this is
And ongoing.
5 years post publication of the recommendation. So we hope that a change will be made. We're thrilled that it has come to the attention of several congressional representatives and it has appeared in the proposed legislation. May I also address something that Kay mentioned, and that's the importance of community and listening to people with lived experience. We're very grateful that the NIH received $30 million for the Improve initiative, which is implementing a maternal health and pregnancy outcomes vision for everyone. And a core component of that is two major aspects that involve the community, because each community has different needs. And it may be one thing in Alabama, it may be another thing in inner city New York City. Transportation, nutrition, trust issues, whatever. We are centralizing the importance of community in this Improve initiative, which is just rolling out now in terms of the challenges.
There's a question about specific categories of products, particularly SSRIs, that are often used during pregnancy and lactation because of depression. And I think you mentioned something, Rebecca, about that being one of the major conditions related to pregnancy and lactation. So has your society focused on that kind of issue?
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. I think as our members are kind of thinking about treating mental health conditions and pregnancy, there really hasn't been really good studies done in this space. And because of that, physicians and also patients, I think that we have physicians that are having, it's tricky to counsel, and then there's patients that have heard that there might be risks to the fetus and aren't willing to take. And because there's not good information either done before approval of those products or even in the post-market space, there's lots of conflict there. People just decide not to take the medication. And so I think that as we think about some of the work that Dr. Bianchi's team is doing and the research they're funding, we're really excited about any opportunities to really kind of build out some additional funding for research that focuses on those medications that folks often use during pregnancy and where there's a high burden of morbidity and mortality. And I think SSRIs are a great example of something that needs additional study.
We're about to, this has been, I think, a wonderful panel and so much good information. And we appreciate all of your participation and comments. And now I will turn it back over to our CEO, Beth Battagliano.
Thank you so much, Marcia, and thank you all for the great presentations today. You all did such an amazing job. And thank you, Marcia, for leading this powerful discussion. And thanks again to our Corporate Advisory Council for making today's webinar possible. And lastly, thank you all for attending. We will be following up a bit later with a recording of today's event, and we hope that you will share it with other colleagues who may not have been able to attend. It is clear that it will take all of us, government, not-for-profits, corporations, and the research community to ensure appropriate representation. Healthy Women will continue to work closely on this issue, and I hope you'll reach out to Healthy Women as a resource and a potential partner for additional work you may be doing to help advance the health of women and families. Lastly, please continue to visit our website at healthywomen.org for the latest in women's health information. Thank you all again and have a great rest of your afternoon.